At my father's retirement dinner at the most exclusive country club in Atlanta, he raised his crystal glass and announced to a room full of our city's elite that only the children who made him proud were truly his. Everyone clapped and cheered. Then he looked dead at me and told me to leave. I stood up slowly, but then my husband stood up too. What he did next left the entire room completely speechless. I am Jada, 33 years old, and for my entire life, I was the family scapegoat. As a corporate restructuring consultant, I spent years fixing other people's disasters, while my own family treated me like one. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The Buckhead Country Club was suffocatingly elegant that night. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over tables draped in white silk and covered with towering floral centerpieces. My father, Calvin, was celebrating his highly publicized retirement as senior vice president of one of the top commercial real estate development firms in the South. The guest list was a gathering of Atlanta's affluent high society. Mayors, city council members, fellow executives, and socialites from my mother's inner circle were all there drinking expensive champagne and laughing at my father's jokes. I sat near the back of the head table in a simple emerald green dress, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Beside me sat my husband, Trey. To my family, Trey was just a quiet community college math adjunct who wore modest suits and drove an older sedan. My mother, Brenda, had spent the entire cocktail hour introducing him to her country club friends with a tight, apologetic smile, always making sure to emphasize that Trey was a very dedicated teacher, as if trying to soften the blow of his average income. She cared about optics above everything else, and an adjunct professor did not fit the wealthy image she desperately wanted to project. The real stars of the evening were my younger sister, Chloe, and her husband, Preston. Chloe sat right next to our father, dripping in diamonds that I knew he had paid for. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Beside her was Preston, a white man my father had taken under his wing. Preston worked as a mid-level director at my father's real estate firm, and everyone in the room knew this dinner was not just a retirement party. It was a coronation. Preston was fully expecting to inherit my father's senior vice president title through sheer nepotism despite being deeply arrogant and secretly incompetent. When the dinner plates were cleared, the room quieted down. My father stood up, smoothing the lapels of his custom tuxedo, and tapped his spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The gentle clinking sound brought a hush over the massive ballroom. He picked up his microphone and began his speech. He talked about his humble beginnings, his relentless drive, and the empire he had helped build over 30 years. He spoke about legacy and the importance of passing the torch to the right hands. A man is only as successful as the legacy he leaves behind. My father said, his voice echoing through the speakers. And that legacy lives on through the children who carry his name and his vision with pride. Only the children who made me proud are truly mine. The room erupted in polite applause. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a cloth napkin, looking like the perfect supportive wife. My father gestured toward my sister, telling Chloe that she showed the world what grace and ambition looked like. Then he placed a hand on his son-in-law's shoulder, telling Preston he was the son he never had. My father praised him, saying Preston understood the business and understood what it takes to win. He announced he was stepping down tonight, knowing his title and his company were in the best possible hands. More applause washed over the room. Preston smiled smugly, raising his glass to the crowd, while Chloe beamed, soaking in the attention she thrived on. I kept my face perfectly neutral, taking a small sip of my water. I was used to this. I was used to being the footnote in my family's story. But then my father's gaze shifted down the long table and landed squarely on me. The smile faded from his face, replaced by a look of cold calculation. The room seemed to sense the shift in energy, and the applause died down completely. "Then there is Jada," my father said into the microphone. His tone was dismissive, sending a ripple of uncomfortable silence through the guests. He told the crowd he had always believed in hard work and wanted both his daughters to represent excellence. But he claimed some people simply refused to elevate themselves. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to sit completely still. I could feel Trey's hand gently resting on my knee under the table, a steady grounding presence. My father continued calling me a glorified paper pusher and a crisis consultant who merely cleaned up messes instead of building anything of real value. He stated he only invited me tonight because my mother insisted, but looking at me sitting there, he realized that I simply did not fit the brand of this family. He announced to the silent room that I brought absolutely nothing to the table. A collective gasp rippled through the nearest tables. My mother looked away, staring intently at her plate, refusing to meet my eyes or intervene. Chloe actually smirked, leaning over to whisper something in Preston's ear. Preston chuckled, looking at me with pure disdain. My father hardened his voice, claiming he had worked too hard to have his legacy tarnished by mediocrity. He declared this was a celebration for the people who actually built this empire and the people who would lead it into the future. He looked me dead in the eyes and said I was neither of those things, and told me I could leave now. The silence that followed was deafening. Hundreds of eyes turned to stare at me, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to run out of the ballroom in shame, hiding my face, just like the broken little girl my father always treated me as. I looked at my father standing there under the chandelier, so proud of the public humiliation he had just orchestrated. I looked at my mother, who would rather watch her daughter be publicly destroyed than cause a scene. I looked at Chloe and Preston, practically glowing with satisfaction at my expense. I did not cry. I did not shrink down in my chair. Instead, I reached for my purse and stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a loud scrape that echoed across the silent room. But as I stood to leave, Trey stood up right next to me. I glanced at my husband. He was perfectly calm, smoothing the front of his modest suit jacket. He looked up at my father, and what he did next would change the trajectory of my entire family forever. I pressed my hand firmly against Trey's wrist, signaling him to wait. I could feel the heat of his anger radiating through his suit jacket, but this was my moment. For 33 years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace in this family. I had smiled through the insults, minimized my own success, and played the dutiful, quiet daughter while they paraded around Atlanta high society. That stopped tonight. I picked up my evening bag and looked directly at my father. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could hear the ice melting in the crystal water glasses. The city's most prominent figures, judges, politicians, and my mother's sorority sisters were all staring at me. A glorified paper pusher, I said, my voice steady and resonant, cutting through the heavy air. Is that what we are calling it now? My father narrowed his eyes, his jaw clenching. I told you to leave, Jada. Do not make this harder on yourself. I took a step away from the table, but I did not turn toward the exit. Instead, I turned my gaze to Preston. He was sitting next to my sister, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he noticed the unwavering focus in my eyes. Preston, the golden boy. The white son-in-law who had been handed a career on a silver platter simply because he married the right woman and played golf with the right man. Let us talk about my paper-pushing Preston, I said, taking another step toward the head table. Do you remember that rainy night 3 years ago on Peachtree Street? The night you wrapped a company-issued Mercedes-Benz around a concrete light pole? Preston's face drained of all color. He gripped the edge of the tablecloth, his knuckles turning white. Chloe shifted in her seat, her eyes darting nervously around the room as the wealthy guests began to murmur. I raised my voice, ensuring every single person in that ballroom heard me clearly. You were reeking of cheap bourbon, and you had a 22-year-old intern crying in the passenger seat. You were facing federal charges for driving under the influence and reckless endangerment in a corporate vehicle. Do you remember who my father called at 3 a.m, crying and begging for a miracle? The whispers among the elite crowd grew louder. Several prominent business owners turned to look at my father with expressions of shock and sudden judgment. My father gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles trembling. He called me, I declared, answering my own question. He called the glorified paper pusher. I spent 48 hours awake, bribing the right officials, leveraging every public relations connection I had in this city, and scrubbing the internet clean to keep your mugshot off the evening news. I falsified the narrative so you would not spend 5 years in a federal prison, and so my father's precious company would not face a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was sweating profusely, his custom tuxedo suddenly looking suffocatingly tight. Jada, shut your mouth right now. The sharp hiss came from my right. My mother Brenda had scrambled out of her seat and rushed over to me. She was wearing a stunning designer gown, but there was nothing elegant about the way she grabbed my arm. Her manicured acrylic nails dug painfully into my skin as she tried to physically pull me toward the exit doors. "You are ruining everything," she whispered frantically, her eyes wide with panic as she glanced around at her country club friends. "How dare you air family business in front of these people? Have you lost your mind? Stop embarrassing us and get out." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then I yanked myself free with enough force to make her stumble backward. "You care about embarrassment now, Mom?" I asked, my voice dripping with contempt. "Where was this concern for family optics when you called me crying, asking me to forge the insurance documents to cover his tracks? You told me family protects family. You told me I owed it to you because you paid for my tuition at Howard University. You held my education over my head to blackmail me into saving a man who disrespects me every chance he gets." My mother gasped, pressing her hand to her chest, as if she had been physically struck. Several of her wealthy friends at the nearby tables openly gasped with her. The facade of the perfect, flawless family was completely shattered. "You are a bitter, jealous liar." Chloe finally stood up, pointing a shaking finger at me. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the chandelier light as she raised her arm. "You have always been jealous of my marriage. You are just mad because Daddy chose Preston to take over the company instead of you. You are making all of this up because you are a pathetic loser who works a miserable desk job." I turned to my sister, feeling nothing but absolute pity for her delusion. "Jealous of you, Chloe?" I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "I am not jealous of a woman whose husband uses company funds to pay off his illegal sports gambling debts while she is busy picking out designer shoes at Phipps Plaza. I am the one who hid the audit reports from the board so you would not lose your precious mansion. You have been living on my charity for years." "That is enough!" My father roared, his voice booming over the sound system. He slammed his hand down on the table, sending silverware clattering. "Security! Get this woman out of my sight immediately. She is no longer my daughter." Two large security guards in dark suits began making their way across the ballroom floor, pushing past the stunned guests. "You do not need to call security." "Calvin," I said, dropping the title of Dad entirely. "I am perfectly happy to walk out of this room and leave you with the absolute fraud of a successor you have chosen. You parade Preston around as a business genius, while treating your own black daughter like a maid hired to clean up your filthy messes. You demand respect, but you have absolutely zero integrity." I turned around to leave, my head held high. I had delivered my truth and exposed the rot hiding behind their expensive clothes and country club memberships. But as I took my first step toward the exit, Trey moved. He did not follow me to the door. Instead, he stepped directly into the path of the advancing security guards, raising one hand to halt them. The calm, unassuming math teacher was gone. In his place stood a man radiating pure, unadulterated authority. He reached inside his jacket pocket, and the entire room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Preston let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed across the silent ballroom. He leaned back in his chair and pointed his half-empty champagne glass at my husband. "Sit down, Trey." Preston slurred slightly, the expensive bourbon and champagne sloshing over the rim of his crystal glass. "You are just a community college math tutor. Do not try to play the hero here before these guards toss you out on the street with your crazy wife." Trey did not blink. He did not raise his voice or shift his posture. He simply stood there looking at Preston with the kind of absolute calm that only comes from possessing real, lethal power. The two security guards who had been marching toward us suddenly stopped in their tracks. Something in my husband's demeanor made them freeze completely. Trey was not wearing a flashy velvet tuxedo like the other men in the room, but the way he carried himself commanded immediate, absolute submission. "I think there has been a misunderstanding, Preston," my husband said smoothly. His voice projected perfectly carrying to the furthest corners of the room without him ever needing a microphone. I do teach a seminar on macroeconomics at the community college. I enjoy giving back to the youth in our city, but that is volunteer work. That is not my day job. Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a loud theatrical sigh that carried over the silent crowd. Nobody cares about your charity work, Trey. Just get out of here so my father can finish his retirement celebration and we can enjoy our night. You are ruining our family moment. Trey ignored her completely. He reached inside the breast pocket of his dark tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. He stepped forward with slow, deliberate purpose and placed it squarely on the pristine white tablecloth right next to my father's dinner plate. "My name is Trey Vanguard," he announced. The room became so quiet you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Pinnacle Private Equity." A collective gasp ripped through the audience. Even if my family was too arrogant to do their research, the corporate elites sitting at the surrounding tables knew exactly who Vanguard Pinnacle was. It was one of the most ruthless and successful private equity firms in the entire country, holding billions of dollars in commercial real estate assets. I watched my father's face drain of all color. The smug satisfaction completely vanished from his features, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at the black folder on the table as if it were a live explosive device. "That is impossible, my mother," Brenda stammered. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "You drive a used Honda. You live in a basic townhouse in the suburbs. You cannot be a billionaire." "I drive a reliable car because I do not need a hood ornament to validate my net worth," Brenda Trey replied coolly. "And I live in that specific suburb because Jada loves her garden. But we are not here to discuss my real estate portfolio. We are here to discuss yours, Calvin." My father opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him. He looked down at the folder and then back up at Trey, his chest heaving under his custom tuxedo. Drops of sweat began to form on his forehead, catching the light of the chandeliers. Preston slammed his hand on the table, trying to regain control of the narrative. "This is a pathetic bluff. You are a teacher. You do not own any equity firm. Security, I said, get them out of here right now." Trey did not even look at Preston. He kept his eyes locked firmly on my father. "At precisely 9 in the morning today, Vanguard Pinnacle executed a hostile takeover of your commercial real estate firm, Calvin. We acquired the remaining 51% of your voting shares from your extremely disgruntled board of directors. Your company was practically bleeding money thanks to the offshore accounts your son-in-law Preston has been funneling company profits into for the last 18 months. Chloe shrieked, dropping her champagne flute. The glass shattered against the polished hardwood floor, but no one moved to clean it up. She whipped her head toward Preston, whose face had gone completely white. "You are stealing money," Chloe screamed at her husband. "We are supposed to be rich." Preston was hyperventilating now, loosening his silk bow tie as he desperately looked around the room for an exit. "It is a lie," he gasped, stumbling backward. "It is corporate sabotage. They are setting me up." "It is fully documented in the forensic audit inside that folder," Trey said calmly, never raising his voice above a steady conversational tone. "My firm specializes in acquiring distressed assets, Calvin, and your company became a distressed asset the moment you allowed an incompetent embezzler to run your operations while simultaneously treating your most capable daughter like garbage. Jada knew about the takeover, of course. My firm hired her independent public relations agency to manage the fallout of your eventual arrest. She advised me to let you dig your own grave tonight in front of all your friends." My father looked like he was about to pass out. He grabbed the edge of the wooden podium, his knees buckling slightly. "I am retiring," he wheezed, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "I am stepping down tonight. I have a legacy. I have a multi-million-dollar severance package. I built this city." "That brings me to my final point," Trey said slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. "You are not retiring, Calvin. You are being fired with cause by the new ownership. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your title, your office access, and your company vehicle. But my pension..." My father choked out, his eyes wide with absolute panic as he reached for the folder. My retirement package. Trey offered a small, razor-sharp smile that sent shivers down my spine. Because your gross negligence allowed Preston to embezzle millions of dollars from the shareholders, I have legally frozen your golden parachute. You are leaving this company with absolutely nothing, Calvin. Not a single dime. All your corporate accounts have been locked as of 10 minutes ago. I suggest you retain a very good criminal defense attorney. You and Preston are both going to need one by tomorrow morning. Trey turned his back on my devastated family and offered me his arm. I took it, feeling a surge of pure, triumphant power course through my veins. We did not run out of the room. We walked out slowly and deliberately while the elite members of Atlanta high society watched the total collapse of my father's fraudulent empire. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, ruining her expensive makeup. Chloe was screaming at Preston, hitting his chest while he stood frozen in sheer panic. My father sank into his chair, staring blankly at the black folder that had just destroyed his entire life. We walked out the heavy double doors into the warm Atlanta night, leaving them to drown in the very mess they had created. The morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office in downtown Atlanta. My public relations firm occupied the top 3 floors of a highly coveted building, a physical testament to the empire I had built entirely with my own 2 hands. I was sipping my black coffee and reviewing the preliminary media coverage of Vanguard Pinnacle's latest corporate acquisition when the heavy glass doors of my executive suite burst open. My assistant tried frantically to block the entryway, but my mother pushed past her with the desperate, chaotic energy of a woman who had just watched her entire social standing evaporate overnight. Brenda was usually the absolute picture of affluent Southern aristocracy. She never stepped out of her house without perfect hair-tailored designer clothes and a polite smile that hid her constant judgment. Today, her designer silk blouse was deeply wrinkled. Her usual flawless blowout looked slept in, and her eyes were wild with a mixture of panic and pure rage. She slammed her oversized designer bag onto my mahogany desk, scattering my confidential quarterly reports all over the floor. You are going to call that lying husband of yours right now and tell him to call off this ridiculous stunt, my mother hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed hysteria. Your father has been up all night on the phone with a team of corporate lawyers. His keycard was actually denied at the executive parking garage this morning. He was turned away by a security guard making $15 an hour. Do you have any idea the level of humiliation he is facing right now? I did not flinch. I calmly signaled for my assistant to leave the room and closed the heavy glass door behind her, ensuring our absolute privacy. Then I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers. It is not a stunt, Mom, I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy. Trey owns Vanguard Pinnacle. The ink on the hostile takeover dried at exactly 9 yesterday morning. Calvin is no longer a senior vice president. He is an unemployed liability who allowed his son-in-law to embezzle millions in corporate funds. My mother slammed her hands flat on my desk, leaning over to glare at me with absolute hatred. You ungrateful little snake, she spat. You planned this entire spectacle. You orchestrated this whole situation using your public relations firm just to get back at Chloe and Preston because you have always been bitter and jealous of your sister. You let Trey humiliate your father in front of the mayor, the city council, and half of my sorority sisters. We are an absolute laughingstock today, Jada. My phone has not stopped ringing since we left the country club. Chloe is at my house right now, crying so hard she can barely breathe because Preston's company accounts are completely frozen. You are going to call Trey right now and tell him to reverse the acquisition, or so help me God, I will destroy your career. I stood up, mirroring her aggressive posture but keeping my composure absolute. You cannot reverse a legal corporate acquisition, Brenda. And even if I could, I would not lift a single finger to save a man who stood on a stage last night and told a room full of people that I was not his real daughter. You sat there and watched him do it. You tried to drag me out of the room by my arm just to protect his fragile ego. You made your choice last night. My mother sneered, waving her hand dismissively as if my public humiliation was completely irrelevant. "We are a pillar of the Black community in Atlanta," she yelled. "Your father sits on the board of hospitals and museums. You are letting your husband tear down a successful Black man just to steal his wealth and feed your own petty insecurities." "He did not own the company, Mom," I replied coldly. "He was just a highly paid employee who let his arrogant white son-in-law treat the corporate accounts like a personal casino." Preston stole from the shareholders, and Calvin looked the other way because he was too obsessed with keeping up appearances. "Preston was making aggressive investments, and your father authorized them," my mother screamed, refusing to accept the reality of the crimes. "Your husband twisted the audit numbers to make it look like a felony so he could steal the company out from under your father. You are a traitor to your own family, Jada. You are aiding and abetting the destruction of your own blood." She straightened up her face, twisting into a mask of pure venomous entitlement. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest, utilizing the very weapon she had kept sharpened and ready for 15 long years. "You owe us," she screamed, the sound vibrating against the glass walls of my office. "You owe this family everything you have. Do not sit in this expensive glass office and act like you built this empire from the ground up all on your own. We gave you the foundation to even exist in this ruthless corporate world. We paid every single dime of your tuition at Howard University so you could get your fancy degree and sit here judging the people who raised you. We sacrificed our hard-earned money to make sure you had the best education a Black woman could ask for. And this is the loyalty you show us in return. You are going to pick up that phone and fix this massive mess, Jada, because you owe me for every single opportunity you have ever had in your miserable life." I slammed my laptop shut. The sharp crack of metal meeting metal echoed through the glass suite, cutting my mother's delusions completely in half. I stood up, planting both hands flat on my desk, and leaned across the mahogany surface until I was inches from her face. "You paid every dime of my tuition at Howard," I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. "Are you actually going to stand in my office and lie to my face about the single most traumatic financial experience of my entire life?" She crossed her arms, her designer rings catching the sunlight. "I am not lying, Jada. We set up that college fund the day you were born. Your father worked 80-hour weeks to put that money away just for you." "You set it up," I agreed, nodding slowly. "But you did not spend it on my education, Brenda. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me what happened to the $85,000 in that account 2 months before my freshman year began. Look at me and say it." My mother averted her gaze, suddenly very interested in the modern art painting on my wall. "We had a temporary liquidity issue," she muttered defensively. "We needed to reallocate some assets. You know business was slow that quarter, and your father had obligations." "Reallocate some assets." I laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Is that what we are calling Chloe's $150,000 destination wedding in Turks and Caicos? You drained my entire college fund so your golden child could fly 200 people to a private island and marry a mediocre white man who would eventually embezzle your husband into early retirement. You spent my tuition on imported white orchids and a custom ice sculpture while I was packing my bags for Washington." She deserved a beautiful day, my mother snapped, her tone shifting from defensive to vicious. "She was marrying into the right circles, Jada. It was a networking opportunity for your father. We told you we would pay you back when the market recovered. You were just being selfish, making it all about yourself as usual. We needed to secure Chloe's future, and Preston's family expected a certain standard from us. I did not ask for a private island, Mom. I asked for the money you promised me so I could afford my dorm room and my textbooks. Because of your networking opportunity, I was sitting in the financial aid office crying my eyes out while signing my name to $75,000 in predatory student loans just to stay enrolled. I worked the graveyard shift at a hotel front desk. I bussed tables at a sports bar on weekends. I tutored freshmen in statistics between my own classes. I survived on 4 hours of sleep a night and dollar-sliced pizza for 4 straight years to get the degree you are now trying to take credit for. While Chloe was posting photos from her overwater bungalow in Bora Bora, I was begging my landlord not to evict me because my scholarship check was late. You left me to drown in debt while you drank champagne on a beach. Well, it built character. My mother sniffed, adjusting her silk collar. You are successful now, aren't you? It clearly made you a harder worker. You should be thanking us for pushing you to be independent instead of coddling you. We gave you the gift of resilience. Thanking you, I shook my head in pure disbelief at her staggering narcissism. I paid off the last of those student loans 2 years ago. Not once did you or Calvin ever offer a single dime to help me. Not once did you apologize for stealing my future to fund Chloe's vanity project. And yet you have the absolute audacity to march into the company I built with the blood and sweat you caused and demand that I save your sinking ship. Your father is a broken man, Jada. My mother cried, her voice rising again, trying to reclaim the victim narrative. The bank is going to call in his personal guarantees. If Vanguard Pinnacle does not back off, we will lose everything. The country club memberships, the cars, the social standing. Our entire reputation in Atlanta will be destroyed. Do you want your own mother to be destitute? Is that what you really want to see? I want you to experience the exact same independence you forced onto me, I replied coldly. I want you to build some of that character you just praised me for. Vanguard Pinnacle operates completely independently of my public relations firm. Trey makes his own business decisions, and he decided that a company run by thieves is ripe for restructuring. I am not lifting a finger to stop him. You dug this grave when you chose optics over ethics, and you certainly chose Chloe over me. Now you get to lie in it. My mother stared at me, her chest heaving. The realization that guilt and manipulation were no longer working seemed to finally compute. Her eyes narrowed, and the fake tears instantly dried up, revealing the ruthless, calculating woman underneath. Fine, she hissed, grabbing her designer bag from my desk with a vicious jerk. If you want to play hardball, we can play hardball. You think you are so untouchable in your glass tower because you have a rich husband and a fancy business. But you forget who actually holds the keys to the roof over your head. You and your billionaire husband might be acting high and mighty today, but we will see how smug you are when you are sleeping on the street by the end of the month. My mother stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as she delivered what she believed was her ultimate threat. You think you are so secure in that beautiful suburban townhouse? She spat, her voice echoing off the glass walls of my office. You think because you planted some hydrangeas in the front yard that it belongs to you. Calvin Coe signed that mortgage, Jada. His name is on the paperwork. All he has to do is make one phone call to his friends at the bank and pull his financial backing. We will have you and your lying husband thrown out on the street by the end of the month. Let us see how smug you act when you are packing your life into garbage bags. I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words hang in the silent air. I did not scream. I did not panic. I actually threw my head back and let out a genuine loud laugh. The sound of my laughter seemed to break my mother's brain. She recoiled, staring at me like I had lost my mind. I walked slowly around the edge of my mahogany desk, the sharp click of my heels tapping a steady rhythm against the hardwood floor. You really need to start opening Calvin's mail instead of just looking for your country club gala invitations. Mom, I said, shaking my head in pure amusement. You live in a house of mirrors and you do not even know the glass is cracking. I walked over to the sleek filing cabinet in the corner of my suite. I unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope. I walked back to my mother and held it out to her. She refused to take it, keeping her arms crossed defensively over her chest. I simply shrugged and pulled the thick legal document out myself, unfolding it right in front of her face. This is a property deed, I said, tapping the embossed seal at the top of the page. It is the deed to the townhouse. Notice anything missing? My mother squinted at the paper, her eyes scanning the legal jargon before landing on the ownership line. She froze. Her manicured hand flew to her mouth as all the color drained from her face. Calvin's name is not on here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It just says Jada Vanguard. How did you get his name off the mortgage without his signature? I did not take his name off the mortgage, I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The mortgage does not exist anymore. I bought the house outright from the bank in cash 12 months ago. My mother stumbled backward, hitting the edge of my desk. "That is impossible," she stammered. "Calvin would never agree to sell it to you. He wanted that leverage. He told me he was holding on to it to make sure you behaved." "He did not have a choice, Brenda," I said, stepping closer to her, forcing her to look me in the eye. 14 months ago, Calvin stopped paying his portion of that CO-signed loan. He missed 3 consecutive payments. The bank was preparing to send a foreclosure notice to my front door. My father, the great and powerful real estate titan, was secretly defaulting on a suburban townhouse. "That is a lie," my mother shouted, her denial desperate and immediate. "Calvin has millions. We have investment portfolios. He would never default on a property." "He had millions," I corrected her. "He had millions until your precious white son-in-law started placing 6-figure bets on college basketball games with some very dangerous underground bookies in West Midtown. Preston racked up a massive gambling debt, and those bookies were not going to ask nicely for their money. They threatened to break Preston's legs and expose his addiction to the Atlanta business journals. Calvin was so terrified of the societal scandal, so obsessed with protecting the image of his perfect daughter and her perfect husband, that he liquidated his own cash assets to pay off Preston's debts. He drained his accounts to save Preston and left my house to go into foreclosure." My mother shook her head violently, tears of pure denial springing to her eyes. "No," she gasped. "Preston makes 6 figures. Chloe says they are saving to buy a mansion in Buckhead. They are doing fine." I laughed again, tossing the property deed onto my desk. "They are broke, Mom. They have been broke for 2 years. Why do you think they asked to move into the carriage guest house on my property? They told you they were renovating a condo, but they were actually getting evicted. They have been living in my guest house rent-free for 24 months because they have absolutely nothing. Calvin was too ashamed to tell you that he went broke covering for a degenerate gambler, so he let the bank quietly prepare to seize my home. He threw me to the wolves to protect Chloe." My mother could not speak. She braced herself against my desk, her breathing shallow and ragged. The illusion of her perfect family was crumbling into dust right in front of her eyes. So when the bank called me to warn me about the foreclosure, I did not panic. I said, keeping my tone ruthlessly calm. "I wired the exact payoff amount directly to the bank. I bought the property outright. I am the sole legal owner of the land, the main house, and the guest house." I reached back into the cream-colored envelope and pulled out a bright yellow sheet of legal paper. I held it up, letting the bold black letters catch the morning light. "And since I am the sole legal owner," I continued, taking a step closer to my hyperventilating mother, "I have the right to decide who lives on my property." I slapped the yellow paper directly against her chest. She reflexively grabbed it, her eyes darting across the bold heading. It was an official 30-day notice to vacate. "You can give that to Chloe when you go back to your house to comfort her," I said, my voice entirely void of any emotion. "They have been living on my charity for 2 years while treating me like garbage. That ends today. They have exactly 30 days to pack up their designer clothes, their fake jewelry, and whatever dignity they have left and get off my land. If Chloe and Preston are not completely gone by the 1st of the month, I will personally have the Fulton County Sheriff drag them out of the guest house and throw their belongings onto the street." My mother stared at the eviction notice, her hands trembling so violently the paper shook. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and realization. She finally understood that I was no longer the punching bag she could manipulate. I was the one holding all the cards. "30 days, Brenda," I said, pointing toward the glass door of my office. "Tell the golden child to start looking for cardboard boxes. Now get out of my office." At my father's retirement dinner at the most exclusive country club in Atlanta, he raised his crystal glass and announced to a room full of our city's elite that only the children who made him proud were truly his. Everyone clapped and cheered. Then he looked dead at me and told me to leave. I stood up slowly. But then my husband stood up too. What he did next left the entire room completely speechless. I am Jada, 33 years old, and for my entire life I was the family scapegoat. As a corporate restructuring consultant, I spent years fixing other people's disasters, while my own family treated me like one. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy steel doors of the executive elevator slid closed behind me with a solid thud. I stepped out into the VIP level of my office parking garage. The underground space was quiet, filled only with the rhythmic click of my heels echoing against the concrete. I pressed the button on my keys, and the headlights of my car flashed in the dim light. I was exhausted but running on pure adrenaline. Handing my mother that eviction notice was just the beginning of the surgical extraction I was performing on my toxic family tree. Before I could even reach the driver's side door, a tall figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar blocking my path. It was Preston. He looked nothing like the smug, arrogant golden boy who had been sipping premium champagne at the country club just 24 hours earlier. His expensive designer suit was rumpled. His tie was missing and his collar was unbuttoned, revealing a neck flushed with angry red blotches. He had dark circles under his eyes, pointing to a sleepless night fueled by panic and probably cheap liquor. He smelled like desperation and stale cologne. "You are a dead woman walking, Jada," he spat, taking a step toward me. His fists were clenched at his sides. "Do you actually think you and that community college fraud of a husband can just steal a multi-million-dollar company from my family and walk away clean?" I stopped walking, maintaining a safe physical distance, but keeping my posture completely relaxed. I did not reach for my pepper spray. I did not call out for the garage security. I simply looked at him with the cold, analytical detachment I reserved for my worst public relations clients. "Your family." "Preston," I asked, tilting my head slightly. "That is a fascinating choice of words. You married my sister. You manipulated my father into paying off your illegal gambling debts. You lived rent-free in my guest house for 2 years. And you embezzled money from a company built by a black man who was foolish enough to think your mediocrity was a sign of genius. You do not have a family here, Preston. You have a host that you have been parasitically draining since the day you put a ring on Chloe's finger." His face contorted with rage. He took another step forward, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. It was a classic move for a man who possessed zero actual leverage. "I spent the entire morning on the phone with a team of corporate litigators," Preston snarled, pointing a finger directly at my face. "Real lawyers, Jada. The kind who destroy lives for a living. They are drafting a massive lawsuit against Vanguard Pinnacle and your public relations firm as we speak. We are coming after you for insider trading, corporate espionage, and defamation. You used your relationship with Calvin to illegally obtain financial audits and then fed that confidential information to your husband so he could execute a hostile takeover. That is a federal crime, Jada. You and Trey are going to spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary." I let out a slow, genuine laugh that echoed loudly through the empty concrete garage. The sheer absurdity of his legal threats was almost entertaining. I crossed my arms over my chest and looked him up and down. "Preston, did you get your law degree from a television show?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure condescension. "Insider trading requires the illegal trading of a public company's stock or other securities by individuals with access to non-public information. My father's commercial real estate development firm is entirely privately held. There is no stock to trade, Preston. And corporate espionage implies we stole trade secrets. We did not steal anything. The board of directors approached Vanguard Pinnacle directly because your aggressive offshore investments were bankrupting the firm. They legally handed Trey the financial records because they were begging him to buy them out before the company went completely under." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The absolute certainty in my voice was cracking his fragile facade of control. And as for defamation, I continued taking a slow, deliberate step toward him, forcing him to hold his ground. Defamation requires a false statement presented as a fact. Truth is an absolute defense to defamation, Preston. Every single word Trey said at that retirement dinner was a documented, verifiable fact. You are a degenerate gambler who stole from the shareholders to pay off your bookies. Calvin covered for you and committed financial fraud in the process. There is no lawsuit. Your phantom corporate litigators do not exist because no reputable lawyer in the state of Georgia would touch your radioactive mess of a case. You are a bitter, jealous woman, he yelled, a spray of saliva flying from his mouth. You could not handle the fact that Calvin chose me to run the company. You could not handle the fact that Chloe has a perfect marriage while you are stuck with a boring math teacher. You manufactured this entire crisis to ruin my life out of pure spite. I did not manufacture your gambling addiction, Preston, I replied, my tone dropping to ice. I did not manufacture the forged invoices you signed to funnel company profits into shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. I am a crisis manager. My entire career is built on identifying liabilities and neutralizing them. And you, Preston, are the biggest liability I have ever seen. You thought you could hide your incompetence behind my father's ego, but you forgot that numbers do not have an ego. The numbers exposed exactly what you are, a thief. Preston lunged forward, closing the gap between us. His eyes were wide and frantic, driven by the animalistic instinct of a cornered predator. You are going to sign that company back over, he growled, raising his hand as if he might actually strike me right there in the garage. You are going to fix this, Jada, or I swear to God I will tear your life apart. Before I could verbally dissect his pathetic threat, a sharp mechanical click echoed from the shadows behind a nearby luxury sport utility vehicle. A bright camera flash illuminated the dim parking garage, followed by the steady red light of a smartphone recording video. Do not touch her, Preston, a high-pitched voice called out, trembling with manufactured outrage. I want every single second of her unhinged behavior on camera. I slowly turned my head away from Preston's flushed face and looked toward the source of the light. Stepping out from behind a concrete pillar holding her phone up like a weapon was my sister Chloe. She was dressed in head-to-toe designer athletic wear, looking like she had just come from an expensive Pilates class, but her face was twisted into a mask of pure vindictive triumph. The golden child had arrived, and she thought she had just walked into the perfect trap. The bright red recording light on Chloe's latest luxury smartphone blinked like a tiny warning beacon in the dim parking garage. She stepped fully out from behind the concrete pillar, holding the device steady, with both hands framing me perfectly in the center of her screen. The vindictive, triumphant smirk she wore just a second ago vanished, instantly replaced by a masterclass in performative distress. Her lower lip began to tremble on command, and tears welled up in her perfectly lashed eyes. I am documenting this for my physical safety, Chloe said, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. She pitched her tone perfectly to sound like a terrified victim trapped in a dark basement rather than an entitled woman standing in a secure VIP parking garage. Everyone look at what my sister is doing. She tracked my husband down at her office building and she is verbally attacking him. She is completely unhinged. Preston caught on to her performance immediately. The man who had been ready to physically strike me just 10 seconds ago suddenly shrank back, his shoulders slumping as he raised his hands in a defensive, submissive posture. He backed up until he bumped into his luxury sport utility vehicle, playing the role of the terrified, innocent husband to absolute perfection. Honey, stay back, Preston called out to Chloe, keeping his hands raised for the camera. She is not in her right mind. I just came here to ask for a peaceful family resolution, and she started threatening to destroy our lives. Please just keep recording so we have proof for the police. I stood perfectly still, watching them execute a routine they must have practiced 1,000 times. This was classic Chloe. It was the exact same tactic she had used when we were teenagers. I remembered the night of my high school senior prom vividly. Chloe had snuck into my room and deliberately spilled bleach all over my custom-made gown because she was furious that I had been nominated for prom queen instead of her. When I confronted her, she immediately started screaming and crying, forcing tears down her face as Calvin and Brenda rushed upstairs. Chloe told them I was trying to physically attack her because I was stressed about the dance. Calvin grounded me on the spot, completely ignoring the ruined dress on my floor. I spent my prom night locked in my bedroom while Chloe went out with her friends. She had always weaponized her tears to avoid accountability and paint me as the aggressive, angry black woman. But we were not in Calvin's house anymore, and I was not a helpless teenager. I was a crisis management expert who handled hostile media narratives for multi-billion-dollar corporations. Chloe bringing a camera to a fight with me was like bringing a squirt gun to a heavily armed fortress. You have always been jealous of me, Jada, Chloe cried out, stepping closer so the phone's microphone could pick up her trembling voice clearly. You have hated me for years because Daddy loved me more. You hate that I am beautiful, and you hate that I am married to Preston. You cannot stand that I have a perfect interracial marriage with a successful man who treats me like an absolute queen, while you had to settle for a broke community college teacher who drives a beat-up sedan. I did not flinch. I did not swat at the camera. I simply adjusted my posture, rolling my shoulders back and stepping directly into the center of her frame. Are we broadcasting live to your social media followers, Chloe? I asked, my voice projecting with crystal clear authority. Or are you just recording this for your imaginary corporate litigators? Either way, make sure you hold the lens steady. I want your audience to hear every single word. Chloe faltered for a fraction of a second, surprised that I was not running away or screaming. She expected me to react with rage, which would validate her victim narrative. Instead, I gave her absolute chilling composure. You are trying to steal our inheritance because you are broke and bitter, Chloe continued, trying to regain her momentum. You manipulated your husband into attacking my father so you could steal the family money. You want everything I have. You want my house and my lifestyle. Jealous of your lifestyle, I repeated, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the camera. Let us talk about your perfect lifestyle, Chloe. Let us talk about the $5,000 designer tennis outfit you are currently wearing. Did you buy that with the credit card tied to your personal checking account? Or did you buy it using the corporate expense account Preston manages? Because according to the forensic audit completed yesterday morning, that specific credit card is funded directly by an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Chloe's hands shook and the camera angle dipped slightly. Preston lunged forward, his previous victim persona vanishing. Shut up, Jada, he hissed, reaching for Chloe's arm. Turn the phone off, Chloe. Turn it off right now. No, let her keep recording, I said, raising my voice to ensure the microphone captured it all. You brought the camera out, Chloe, so let us give your audience the truth. You want to talk about your perfect marriage to a successful man. Your husband is not successful. Your husband is a degenerate sports gambler who racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to underground bookies in West Midtown. He did not marry you because he loves you. He married you because Calvin was a desperate status-obsessed mark who would gladly commit corporate fraud to protect his white son-in-law from going to prison. That is defamation, Preston yelled, his face turning purple as he tried to grab the phone from Chloe's hands. She is making it up. Turn it off. I am not making anything up, I said, stepping right up to the camera lens, staring directly into it. My name is Jada Vanguard. My firm handles corporate crisis management. The man standing behind you, Chloe, is an active embezzler. He stole from his own shareholders to pay off violent bookies, and your father covered it up, leaving my house to go into foreclosure in the process. You are not a victim, Chloe. You are an accessory to corporate fraud. Chloe gasped, stepping backward and lowering the phone. The fake tears were completely gone, replaced by genuine raw panic. She looked at Preston, her eyes wide with horror, as she realized what I had just documented on her own device. Preston grabbed her wrist violently, trying to snatch the phone away to delete the footage. Give it to me, you idiot, Preston snarled, dropping his protective husband act completely. She just admitted on camera that she knows about the accounts. Before Preston could pry the phone from Chloe's grip, the screech of high-performance tires echoed through the concrete parking garage. A sleek, midnight black Maybach whipped around the corner, its headlights cutting through the dim garage lighting. The massive luxury vehicle glided to a smooth, silent halt just inches away from Preston's sport utility vehicle, boxing them in completely. The heavy tinted back door of the Maybach swung open. Trey stepped out onto the concrete, his dark tailored suit immaculate, his presence radiating pure, undeniable power. He was holding a thick manila envelope in his right hand. The heavy doors of the Maybach closed with a solid thud that echoed through the concrete parking structure. Trey walked toward us with the measured, confident stride of a man who owned the building, the ground beneath it, and the air we were breathing. He did not rush. He did not look angry. He looked like an executioner arriving for a scheduled appointment. Preston released Chloe's wrist and stumbled backward, bumping hard against the side of his vehicle. His chest heaved as he stared at the thick manila envelope in Trey's right hand. Chloe remained frozen against the concrete pillar, her phone still angled toward us, the recording light still blinking a steady bright red. I turned my attention back to the camera lens. My sister wanted a viral moment, and I was going to give her a masterclass in corporate transparency. Since we are documenting this for your followers, Chloe, I said, keeping my voice perfectly modulated for the microphone, let us get down to the exact accounting. I am a corporate restructuring consultant. I do not make vague accusations. I deal in receipts. Over the past 18 months, your husband funneled exactly $2.4 million out of Calvin's real estate firm. He did it using a vendor manipulation scheme that a first-year accounting student could have spotted. Jada, shut up! Preston begged, his voice cracking. He raised his hands, palms outward. I will sign whatever you want. I will give the house back. Just turn the camera off. But Chloe was too paralyzed by shock to move. Her eyes were wide, fixed on my face as I dismantled her entire reality piece by piece. He created 3 offshore shell companies. I continued, stepping closer to the camera to ensure pristine audio quality. Apex Global Solutions, Blue Horizon Holdings, and Coral Reef Trust. He generated fake invoices for building materials and consulting services that were never rendered. Calvin signed off on those invoices without verifying them because he trusted his brilliant white son-in-law more than he trusted his own internal compliance team. And Preston took that $2.4 million and handed it straight to the sports bookies in West Midtown to cover his catastrophic gambling losses. I stepped back and gestured toward Trey, who had now reached my side. Trey stood shoulder to shoulder with me, presenting a united, impenetrable front. He held out the manila envelope toward Preston. "What is that?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. Preston stared at the envelope as if it were coated in poison. He shook his head, pressing his back flat against the tinted window of his sport utility vehicle. "I am not taking that," he stammered. "You cannot do this. Calvin promised me the vice president position. I am family." "You were family." Trey corrected, his tone absolutely devoid of any sympathy. "Now you are just a massive corporate liability. Take the envelope, Preston." When Preston refused to move, Trey simply dropped the heavy envelope. It hit the concrete floor with a loud slap, landing right at Preston's expensive leather shoes. "That is your official termination letter," Trey said, looking down at him. "You are fired from Vanguard Pinnacle and all its subsidiary holdings, effective immediately. And because you are being terminated with cause due to documented financial fraud, your employment contract is completely nullified. You will receive 0 severance pay. Your corporate health benefits are canceled as of midnight tonight, and all unvested company stock you hold is immediately forfeited back to the firm." Chloe let out a sharp, devastated gasp. She dropped the phone. It clattered against the pavement, the screen cracking upon impact, but the recording light kept flashing. She looked at her husband, her perfect acrylic nails digging into her designer athletic jacket. "You told me we were rich!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the garage walls. "You told me my dad gave you the company." "Your dad gave him a blank check and a blind eye," I said, looking at my sister with absolute pity. And Preston drove both of them straight off a financial cliff. Preston dropped to his knees on the dirty concrete. The arrogant, entitled man who had tried to intimidate me just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. He reached out with shaking hands and picked up the termination letter, staring at the bold black letters printed on the front. "I can fix this," Preston pleaded, looking up at Trey with tears streaming down his face. "I can pay it back. I will work for free. Just give me time. If you fire me, I will lose everything. The bookies will come after me. I have a wife to support. Please, man to man, you have to give me a chance to make this right." Trey adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket, looking down at Preston with the cold detachment of a true apex predator. "Man to man, you should have thought about your wife before you stole from her family," Trey replied. And as the new chief executive officer of this firm, I have a strict fiduciary duty to my shareholders. I cannot harbor an active embezzler on my payroll, Preston. It is a massive legal liability. Preston swallowed hard, wiping his nose with the back of his trembling hand. So what happens now? He whispered, his voice entirely broken. Do I just pack up my desk? You do not have a desk anymore, Trey said smoothly. Building security cleared out your office an hour ago. Your personal items are sitting in a cardboard box by the loading dock. But honestly, Preston, packing your belongings should be the absolute least of your concerns right now. Preston looked up, confusion cutting through his panic. What do you mean? Trey offered a small, chilling smile. When my forensic accountants uncover $2.4 million in wire fraud and embezzlement, I am legally obligated to report it to the authorities. I sent the complete audit files, the forged invoices, and the shell company banking records to the Atlanta Police Department White Collar Crime Division at 8 o'clock this morning. I also courtesy copied the Federal Bureau of Investigation since you wired the stolen funds across international borders. The sound of distant police sirens began to echo down the street outside the parking garage, growing louder by the second. They are not coming to help you, Preston, I said, stepping back toward the Maybach. They are coming to arrest you. As the police sirens grew deafening outside the parking garage, I did not stay to watch Preston get handcuffed against the cold concrete. I had a business to run and a narrative to control. I walked straight to the private elevator with Trey and rode back up to my executive suite. The moment I sat behind my mahogany desk, I opened my laptop. Crisis management is a game of speed and perception. If you do not tell the story first, someone else will tell it for you, and I refuse to let my family spin their way out of this massive disaster. I drafted a razor-sharp press release. I detailed the Vanguard Pinnacle takeover and the immediate termination of a mid-level director due to catastrophic financial discrepancies. I did not name Preston directly, but I included enough specific details about Calvin's former company that any decent financial journalist could connect the dots within 5 minutes. I highlighted the millions of dollars unaccounted for and the active law enforcement involvement. I knew exactly how the Atlanta business scene operated. Gossip was a highly valuable currency, and I had just handed them a gold mine. I hit send, distributing the file to my top contacts at the Atlanta Business Chronicle and several high-profile digital news outlets. My phone began vibrating almost instantly. Notifications flooded my screen as the news broke across the city. The corporate elite were waking up to the reality that Calvin's pristine empire was built on a mountain of embezzled cash and degenerate gambling debts. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had lined them up. But while the business world was reading about her husband's impending federal indictment, my sister Chloe was doing the only thing she knew how to do when faced with reality. She was running away to spend money that did not belong to her. My office phone rang with a restricted number. I answered it, expecting a journalist calling for a comment on the press release. Instead, I was greeted by the sound of hyperventilating sobs. It was Chloe. Her voice was shrill, echoing with absolute panic. She was crying so hard she could barely form complete sentences. "Jada! You have to help me!" she gasped over the line. "I am at Lenox Square. I just came to the Prada boutique to clear my head after what Trey did in the garage." I needed a minute to breathe. I tried to buy a bag and a pair of shoes, but the terminal declined my card. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the Atlanta skyline out my window. "You went shopping, Chloe. Your husband is currently sitting in the back of a Fulton County police cruiser facing decades in federal prison, and you decided to go buy a designer handbag." "I tried all my cards," Chloe wailed, ignoring my question entirely. "I tried the Black American Express. I tried the corporate platinum card. I even tried the joint checking debit card. The machine kept flashing a fraud alert. The store manager actually came over and took my corporate card away. She cut it in half with scissors right in front of the other customers." Jada. Everyone was staring at me. The security guard told me I had to leave the store. "You have to call Trey and tell him to unfreeze my accounts right now. I do not have cash to pay for parking. I am trapped at the mall." I felt a profound sense of satisfaction settling deep into my bones. "Trey did not freeze your personal cards, Chloe," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly calm. The Federal Bureau of Investigation froze your cards. When you are married to a man who uses offshore shell companies to launder millions of dollars, the federal government tends to seize every single asset tied to his name. Your accounts are part of an active criminal investigation. You have absolutely $0 to your name. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic wail that forced me to hold the phone away from my ear. You are doing this on purpose. You are just trying to humiliate me because you always hated that I had nicer things than you. You want me to look like a beggar in front of the sales associates who treat me like royalty. I hated that you were a thief, Chloe, I replied sharply. Do you remember when we were 19 and you stole $300 out of my bedroom drawer? It was my tip money from waitressing double shifts at the diner. You used it to buy VIP tickets to a music festival, and when I confronted you, Mom grounded me for accusing you without proof. You have been spending other people's money your entire life. You built your entire identity on swiping plastic that you never had to pay off. Now the federal government is finally holding you accountable, and you want me to save you from the embarrassment. You are evil, she screamed, her voice cracking. Call Dad, call Calvin right now and tell him to wire me some cash. Tell him I am stranded at Lenox. Calvin cannot wire you anything, Chloe, I said, checking my watch. His assets are tied to the company Vanguard just acquired. His bank accounts have been locked down for the compliance audit to ensure he was not hiding Preston's stolen funds. He is as broke as you are. You spent your whole life looking down on people who actually work for a living, and now you are standing in a luxury mall with empty pockets. I suggest you ask the security guard for a bus token because you are never stepping foot inside a designer boutique again. I hung up the phone, cutting off her hysterical sobbing. I did not block her number. I wanted to leave the line open so I could witness every single stage of her inevitable collapse. Chloe had spent 3 decades coasting on the unearned privilege my parents handed her, and today, gravity was finally doing its job. I pulled my car through the massive wrought iron gates of Calvin's Buckhead estate. The gates were surprisingly wide open. The private security guard who usually manned the front booth was nowhere to be seen. It seemed the financial hemorrhage was already claiming its first casualties. I was only there to retrieve a small wooden box of my grandmother's diaries from the attic before the bank inevitably seized the property. I had no intention of speaking to anyone, but the chaos unfolding inside the mansion made a quiet exit impossible. I stepped through the heavy oak double doors which had been left completely ajar. The grand foyer with its sweeping marble staircase and imported crystal chandelier echoed with the shrill, hysterical sounds of my sister having a complete psychological breakdown. I stood silently in the arched doorway of the formal living room, watching the absolute destruction of the golden child. Chloe was pacing across the Persian rug, her designer athletic jacket completely soaked in cold sweat. She was clutching her deactivated credit cards like they were winning lottery tickets that had suddenly caught fire. She screamed at our father, demanding that he open his laptop and wire cash to her immediately. She yelled about the humiliating scene at the luxury boutique, about being escorted out by mall security, and about Preston being hauled away in a police cruiser. She demanded a bailout. She demanded he fix it exactly the way he had fixed every single mistake she had ever made since she was a teenager. Calvin was sitting heavily in his leather armchair, staring blankly at the far wall. The powerful, commanding executive who had humiliated me in front of hundreds of people just last night was entirely gone. He looked incredibly old and physically shrunken. His phone rested on his knee, its screen completely dark. He did not move to open his laptop. He did not reach for his checkbook. He just sat there, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. Chloe threw a heavy crystal coaster across the room, letting it shatter violently against the stone fireplace. She screamed at him to stop ignoring her and call his wealth management team. She told him her life was over and he was the only one who could stop the bleeding. Calvin slowly lifted his head and looked at his favorite daughter. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual booming authority. He told her there was no wealth management team left to call. He told her he had spent the entire morning screaming at bank managers and corporate attorneys, only to hit the exact same brick wall. Calvin explained that when Vanguard Pinnacle executed the takeover, Trey instituted a complete freeze on all executive compensation and asset transfers. But the real death blow came from the federal authorities. Because Preston had used Calvin's company as a shield for his embezzlement, the federal investigators had secured an immediate injunction against Calvin's personal portfolios. They locked down his checking accounts, his savings, his retirement funds, and his offshore investment trusts to ensure he was not hiding any of the stolen money. Chloe stopped pacing. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at the man she had worshipped her entire life, the man who had bought her absolute loyalty with luxury cars and private islands. She asked him how much cash he had in the house. She begged him for anything just enough to hire a defense attorney for Preston or to book a hotel room. Calvin closed his eyes and admitted he did not even have enough accessible cash to pay the landscaping crew for the week. The reality crashed down on Chloe with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. The limitless bank of Dad was permanently closed. She was married to a federally indicted criminal. Her bank accounts were seized, and the only person she had ever relied on for financial rescue was sitting in a mansion he could no longer afford to maintain. "You promised me we were safe," Chloe sobbed, dropping to her knees on the expensive rug. "You told me Preston was a genius. You told me we were the untouchable ones. How could you let this happen to me?" Calvin did not answer her. He could not. The delusion of his privilege had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard consequences of his own arrogance. He had sacrificed his integrity and his relationship with his most capable daughter, just to maintain the illusion of a perfect, high society family. Now that illusion was entirely shattered. I stood in the doorway watching the golden child realize that she had absolutely no survival skills of her own. She had spent 30 years relying on nepotism and unearned wealth to shield her from the real world. Now the real world had arrived at her front door, and she was completely defenseless. I felt no guilt watching her weep on the floor. I felt no urge to step into the room and offer comfort. I simply watched the inevitable result of enabling incompetence. This was the natural conclusion of Calvin's parenting strategy. He had raised a daughter who believed she was entitled to everything without ever having to work for it. And when the money ran out, she did not know how to stand on her own 2 feet. She just knew how to crawl on the floor and beg for a handout that was no longer coming. I leaned against the wooden doorframe, studying them the way I would study a failing corporation during a restructuring audit. When a company goes bankrupt, the employees who survive are the ones who know how to pivot, the ones who have actual tangible skills. The employees who get crushed are the ones who only knew how to take credit for other people's labor. Chloe was the ultimate failed employee. She had spent her entire existence coasting on my father's status while I was building a fortress of independent wealth. My father finally looked up from his knees and his eyes met mine across the vast expanse of the formal living room. He saw me standing there in my tailored business suit, radiating the exact kind of calm, stable authority he had always desperately craved, but never actually possessed. He saw the daughter he had thrown away standing strong, while the daughter he had chosen was crumbling into pieces on his floor. For a brief second, I thought he might call out to me. I thought he might swallow his massive pride and beg me to use my public relations firm to save whatever fragments of his reputation were still intact. I could see the desperate calculation turning behind his tired eyes. But before he could formulate the words to ask for my help, my mother walked into the room carrying a stack of legal documents, and the screaming match shifted into an entirely new phase of destruction. My mother threw a thick stack of manila folders onto the glass coffee table with enough force to crack the fragile surface. "These just arrived by special courier," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "They are federal asset freeze notifications, Calvin. The government is seizing the country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, and the vacation home in Hilton Head. The bank is locking us out of everything. We are entirely cut off from our own lives." Chloe stared at the manila folders as if they were venomous snakes. Then she turned her rage entirely onto the 2 people who had created her. "You ruined my life!" Chloe shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at our parents. You told me I would never have to worry about money. You told me my only job was to look beautiful and marry a man who looked good in a tailored suit. You handed me platinum credit cards instead of a work ethic. You never taught me how to work. I do not even know how to write a basic resume, and now I am married to a broke felon with $0 to my name. Brenda gasped, clutching her chest in horror. How dare you speak to us that way? We gave you everything, Chloe. We bought you that lavish lifestyle so you could be the envy of Atlanta. You bought a prop, Chloe yelled right back, tears streaming down her face. You bought a human doll to show off to your elite sorority sisters, and now the doll is completely bankrupt. Preston is going to prison, and I am going to end up working retail because you raised me to be completely useless. I did not wait for the argument to escalate further. I stepped fully into the formal living room, my heels clicking sharply against the imported marble floor. I walked straight past my screaming family and headed directly for the antique mahogany curio cabinet in the far corner of the room. I was not there to mediate a civil war. I was there for one specific reason. I opened the heavy glass door of the cabinet and reached for the faded velvet box sitting on the middle shelf. Inside was my grandmother's vintage sapphire necklace. It was the only item in this massive hollow mansion that held any actual emotional value. My grandmother had specifically written in her will that she wanted me to have it, but Brenda locked it away years ago, claiming I was not polished enough to wear it properly. Today, I was taking back what rightfully belonged to me. Calvin suddenly snapped his head up. His eyes locked onto me, and the fog of his depression instantly vanished, replaced by the desperate, demanding arrogance I had known my entire life. Jada, he barked, standing up from his leather chair. You are here. Good. Stop messing around with that jewelry and listen to me. We have a catastrophic situation and you need to do your job. I closed the velvet box and slipped it safely into my handbag. Then I turned to look at the man who was currently losing his entire empire. My job, I asked, tilting my head slightly. Yes, your job, Calvin demanded, taking an aggressive step toward me. You are a public relations crisis manager. You handle corporate disasters for a living. You have top-level contacts at every major news outlet in this city. You need to call your people right now. You need to kill the story about Preston and the offshore accounts. Spin the narrative, Jada. Tell the press it was a clerical error or a rogue accounting software glitch. Do whatever you have to do to clear my name and get the federal investigators to back off. You owe this family your professional expertise. Brenda rushed over to his side, nodding vigorously. Yes, Jada. For once in your life, do something useful for your father. If you fix this media nightmare, we might be able to negotiate a settlement and save this house. You have to save our reputation before the charity gala this weekend. I looked at my parents and my sister. They were standing together, a united front of pure toxic entitlement, demanding that the daughter they abused step in and shield them from the consequences of their own illegal actions. They honestly believed they could snap their fingers and order the family scapegoat to clean up their mess. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen to wake it up, checking the time. It was exactly 8:55 in the morning. I am already doing my job, Calvin, I said, my voice perfectly calm and absolutely lethal. I am actively managing the public relations for the corporate restructuring. Calvin let out a massive sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping as he wiped sweat from his forehead. Good. Thank God you finally came to your senses and remembered who you are. Now tell me what the strategy is to get us out of this. The strategy is total, absolute transparency, I replied, looking him dead in the eye. You see, Calvin, you are profoundly confused about who my client actually is. I do not work for you. I was hired by the new ownership to handle the media strategy for the commercial acquisition. My client is Vanguard Pinnacle. My client is my husband. The relief on Calvin's face shattered instantly. Brenda took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Chloe stopped crying, completely paralyzed by the sheer gravity of my words. Trey hired my firm to manage the fallout of your corruption. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward my father. I drafted the official press release myself. I spent all night making sure the legal wording was absolutely bulletproof. It is a comprehensive media package. It details exactly how a mid-level director named Preston embezzled $2.4 million to pay off violent underground gambling debts. And more importantly, it details exactly how the senior vice president of the firm looked the other way, committed extreme financial negligence, and actively enabled the theft just to protect his high society image. Calvin began to shake. His chest heaved as he realized the magnitude of the trap he had walked right into. "You cannot do that," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That will destroy me. I will be indicted. The board will seize my entire life." "They already have," I reminded him mercilessly. "You asked me to spin the narrative, Calvin. But the truth is much more profitable. The public relations strategy is to publicly amputate the diseased limb of the company so the new ownership can restore investor confidence. You and Preston are the diseased limb." I looked down at the bright digital clock on my phone screen. The numbers shifted from 8:59 to 9 o'clock. I smiled a cold, victorious smile. In fact, Calvin, I set the official press release on a scheduled automated timer. It was programmed to distribute to the Atlanta Business Chronicle, the Wall Street Journal, and every major local news affiliate at exactly 9 in the morning. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The press release just went live, Calvin. The whole world now knows exactly who you are. 72 hours after the press release hit every major financial news outlet in the state, my parents did the only thing they knew how to do when faced with absolute ruin. They put on their most expensive formal wear and walked straight into the epicenter of Atlanta high society. The annual Jack and Jill Alumni Charity Gala at the St. Regis was the undisputed social event of the season. It was a room packed with the most affluent, influential Black families in the South. Politicians, federal judges, real estate tycoons, and neurosurgeons mingled under massive crystal chandeliers. In any other circumstance, Calvin and Brenda would have skipped the event out of sheer humiliation. Their assets were completely frozen, and Preston's mugshot was currently rotating on the local evening news. But Calvin was a cornered animal, and cornered animals make desperate plays. He needed cash, and he needed it tonight. He needed a bridge loan from one of his old money friends to stop the federal bank from officially seizing the Buckhead mansion. I had my own sources inside the gala, feeding me information before I even arrived. My parents walked into that ballroom wearing smiles so tightly pulled they looked like porcelain masks. They immediately separated to cover more ground. Brenda headed straight for her inner circle of elite sorority sisters, while Calvin made a beeline for the heavy hitters by the bourbon tasting bar. They had spent the last 3 days coordinating a synchronized massive lie to cover up the undeniable truth of my press release. My mother cornered a group of wealthy socialites near the ice sculpture, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of a grieving, devastated matriarch. She clutched a glass of sparkling water, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow, as she told them that her youngest daughter had suffered a complete and total psychological collapse. "It absolutely breaks a mother's heart to see her child lose her grip on reality," Brenda whispered loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear every single word. "Jada has always been so fragile. You all remember how much she struggled during her college years, taking all those odd jobs because she refused to accept our financial help. The stress of running that little public relations firm finally broke her completely." One of the prominent doctor's wives gasped, placing a hand over her pearl necklace. "But Brenda, what about that horrible news article? The one claiming Calvin enabled embezzlement and that Vanguard Pinnacle bought him out." Brenda let out a tragic, dramatic sigh, wiping an imaginary tear from her cheek. Pure paranoid delusion born from a severe mental breakdown, she lied without missing a single beat. Preston made some foolish accounting errors, yes, and Calvin immediately fired him for it. But Jada fabricated that entire hostile takeover story out of pure spite. She is having a psychotic episode, and she dragged her poor, confused husband into it. Trey is just a community college teacher. He does not own any investment firms. Jada hacked into corporate email servers to send out that fake press release. We are working with a judge to have her involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility before she hurts herself or anyone else. It was a masterclass in toxic deflection. My mother was actively trying to execute me socially, using the very struggles she forced upon me to paint me as an unstable, aggressive black woman. She was trying to strip away my professional credibility to save her own skin. Across the ballroom, Calvin was executing his own desperate spin. He cornered Winston, a billionaire logistics developer, and Judge Harrison, two men with enough liquid capital to save his estate. Calvin swirled his bourbon, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. You know how the media exaggerates? Winston. Calvin chuckled, forcing a casual, relaxed posture. Preston was a rogue agent, a bad apple I cut loose the second I found out he was mismanaging petty cash. The federal investigation is just a standard compliance check. The real tragedy is my daughter Jada. She went completely off her medication. She published that slanderous article because I refused to fund her failing business ventures. I am actually looking for a quick $2 million liquidity bridge just to handle some temporary legal restructuring while I sue the publications for defamation. You know I am good for it, with interest. Winston raised an eyebrow, swirling the ice in his glass. He looked at Calvin with a mixture of skepticism and pity. The rumors were spreading like wildfire through the ballroom. People were whispering behind their hands, glancing at Calvin and Brenda with a renewed sense of sympathy. My parents were actually succeeding. By playing the victims of a mentally ill daughter, they were manipulating their peers into opening their checkbooks. Winston actually reached into his tailored jacket pocket, pulling out a platinum business card. Calvin Winston said slowly, If what you are saying about Jada's mental health is true, that is a terrible family tragedy. I might be able to authorize a short-term private loan to help you secure the Buckhead estate until the dust settles. Calvin let out a breath he had been holding for 3 days. His shoulders dropped and his greedy hand reached out to take the business card. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully outmaneuvered a crisis management expert by simply lying to his country club friends. Before Calvin's fingers could even touch the platinum card, the smooth jazz music playing over the ballroom's premium sound system slowly faded out. The event organizer, a tall, elegant woman in a shimmering silver gown, stepped up to the main microphone on the grand stage. The heavy velvet curtains behind her were drawn back, revealing the massive charity auction displays. Ladies and gentlemen, the organizer announced, her voice cutting through the chatter of the room. Before we begin tonight's silent auction, we must take a moment to honor the extraordinary generosity that made this entire evening possible. Please direct your attention to the grand staircase. Calvin smirked, adjusting his bow tie. He expected the announcer to name one of his wealthy golfing buddies. He expected to use the upcoming applause to seal the deal with Winston and walk out of the St. Regis with a $2 million lifeline. We are deeply honored to welcome the primary benefactors of tonight's gala. The organizer continued, gesturing toward the top of the sweeping marble staircase. They have not only fully underwrote this entire event, but their firm has just pledged an unprecedented $5 million donation to our Youth Scholarship Fund. Please give a warm welcome to the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Pinnacle and his wife Trey and Jada Vanguard. The applause began immediately, but Calvin did not clap. His hand froze in midair, inches away from Winston's business card. He slowly turned his head toward the grand marble staircase, his jaw dropping open. Brenda stopped her fake crying instantly, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering against the marble floor. Trey and I stood at the top of the stairs looking down at the sea of Atlanta elite. I was wearing a custom crimson gown that swept the floor, and Trey was impeccably dressed in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. We did not look like a confused teacher and a mentally unstable daughter. We looked exactly like the billionaires who now own the city. We took our first step down the grand marble staircase, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The only sound was the sharp, authoritative click of my heels against the stone and the soft rustle of my custom crimson gown. Trey held my hand with a relaxed, confident grip. We moved with the synchronized grace of a couple who did not just enter a room but completely commanded it. I kept my eyes locked on my father. Calvin was standing frozen near the bourbon tasting bar. His mouth was slightly open and his hand still hovered awkwardly in the air where he had been waiting to receive a $2 million business card. But Winston, the billionaire logistics developer, who had been seconds away from saving Calvin's estate, did not even give my father a parting glance. Winston shoved his platinum business card back into his tailored jacket pocket and practically sprinted across the polished ballroom floor to meet us at the bottom of the stairs. In the ruthless world of Atlanta high society, money talks, but private equity wealth roars. Winston knew exactly who held the real power in the city now. "Mr. Vanguard," Winston said, extending both hands to grasp trays in a gesture of deep, enthusiastic reverence. "I had absolutely no idea your firm was the anonymous donor behind the Youth Scholarship Initiative. It is a brilliant strategic move. We have been trying to secure a meeting with your acquisitions team for 6 months." Trey smiled a polite but impenetrable expression. He did not let go of my hand. The scholarship was entirely my wife's vision, Winston. Jada believes that true wealth is measured by how many doors you can open for the next generation of Black leaders, not by how many luxury cars you park in your driveway. Winston immediately pivoted, turning his full attention to me. The sheer admiration in his eyes was a stark contrast to the way my family had looked at me my entire life. He praised my public relations firm, complimenting the surgical precision of the press release I had issued that morning. He asked for my business card, begging for a consultation. I handed him my card and glanced over his shoulder. Calvin was standing exactly where Winston had left him, completely abandoned. He was holding an empty bourbon glass, watching his last financial lifeline beg for a meeting with the daughter he had just tried to have institutionalized. The devastation on Calvin's face was absolute. He was a ghost in a room he used to rule. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ballroom, my mother was experiencing her own catastrophic social collapse. 2 minutes ago, Brenda was surrounded by her elite sorority sisters, soaking up their pity and feeding them vicious lies about my mental health. But the women in that circle were the wives of judges, surgeons, and corporate executives. They were apex predators in designer gowns, and they could smell a shift in the power dynamic instantly. The moment the event organizer announced our $5 million donation, the entire circle of women physically turned their backs on my mother. They swarmed toward the bottom of the staircase, enveloping me in a cloud of expensive perfume and fake smiles. Vivian, the chapter president and the most influential socialite in the room, reached out to grasp my hands. "Jada, darling." Vivian cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You look absolutely breathtaking. We are all just in awe of your incredible generosity tonight. A $5 million pledge is simply historic." I smiled warmly, looking directly over Vivian's shoulder to lock eyes with my mother, who was standing a few feet away, completely isolated. "Thank you, Vivian," I said, raising my voice so it carried clearly over the chatter of the crowd. It takes a massive amount of focus and clarity to manage a major corporate restructuring while simultaneously launching a charitable foundation. I am just so incredibly grateful that my mental health is absolutely pristine. Several women in the circle stiffened, exchanging sharp, knowing glances. They instantly realized that Brenda had been lying to them. "I know my mother worries," I continued, my tone dripping with manufactured sympathy. "The stress of the federal investigation into my father's company has been very hard on her. It is completely understandable that she might be confused or overwhelmed given the impending fraud indictments. Please keep her in your prayers, Vivian. She is going to need a very strong support system when the bank forecloses on their estate next week." The social freeze was instantaneous and brutal. Vivian and the other women physically stepped away from my mother, creating a visible circle of quarantine around her. In this specific tier of society, proximity to power is everything. But proximity to a federal criminal investigation is an absolute contagion. Nobody wanted to be photographed standing next to the wife of a disgraced executive. Brenda took a desperate step forward, her hands trembling. "Vivian, please," she stammered, her voice cracking. "It is a misunderstanding. Jada is just upset. We are a good family." Vivian did not even look at her. She turned her back, completely shutting Brenda out of the conversation. "I will certainly keep you in my prayers, Brenda," Vivian said coldly over her shoulder. "Excuse us, we are discussing philanthropy with the Vanguards." I watched my mother shrink, retreating into the shadows of the ballroom. I remembered being 16 years old and my mother telling me I could not attend the spring cotillion, because my natural hair and average grades would embarrass the family brand. She made me stay locked in my room while she paraded Chloe around in a custom gown. Tonight, Chloe was nowhere to be found and Brenda was socially radioactive. I was the undisputed crown jewel of the evening and I had built my crown myself. The sheer humiliation of being iced out by the entire room was finally too much for my father to bear. I saw Calvin slam his empty glass down on a passing waiter's tray. His face was flushed dark purple with a mixture of shame and unadulterated rage. He shoved past a group of city council members, ignoring their startled protests, and began marching directly toward me. His fists were clenched at his sides, and his eyes were locked onto mine with a desperate, dangerous intensity. He was a man who had just lost his company, his fortune, and his social standing, and he was coming to claim the only thing he thought he still owned: me. Calvin intercepted me right at the base of the sweeping marble staircase. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing against his stiff collar. He reached out and stepped directly into my path, blocking my way to the main reception area. He tried to use his deep, booming voice to intimidate me, the exact same voice he used to terrorize our household when I was a child. "You think you have won," Calvin hissed, leaning in close so the nearby guests would not hear his threats. "You think you can walk into my city, my social circle with your husbands, money, and humiliate me? I am still your father, Jada. I put clothes on your back. I gave you my name. You owe me absolute respect, and you are going to march right over to Winston right now and tell him this is all a massive corporate misunderstanding." I looked at him. I did not pull away frantically. I did not shrink down. I simply stared at him until he felt the intense, suffocating weight of my gaze and slowly took a half step back. Trey stood right beside me, his presence a silent, lethal warning, but I held up my hand. I did not need my husband to fight this specific battle. I had been preparing for this confrontation my entire life. "Respect," I repeated. I did not whisper. I did not keep my voice down to preserve his fragile peace. I projected my words with the clear, resonant authority of a woman who completely owned her space. The surrounding socialites, the judges, the real estate tycoons, they all stopped their hushed conversations and turned their attention directly to us. "You want respect, Calvin," I said, taking a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to lean his back against the brass railing of the staircase. "Respect is earned. It is not automatically granted to a man who stole from his own shareholders just to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. You stood at the head of the table every single holiday, lecturing me about Black excellence and building generational wealth. You looked down your nose at my business, calling me a paper pusher. Meanwhile, you were sitting in your corner office, signing forged invoices to cover up the fact that your golden son-in-law was handing company profits over to violent underground bookies." "Keep your voice down," Calvin begged, his eyes darting frantically around the silent ballroom. "People are listening. Have some decency." "Decency." I laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Where was your decency when you stood on a stage 4 days ago and told a room full of people that I was not your real daughter? You loved making a public spectacle of me when you thought I was powerless. You reveled in my humiliation. But now that the spotlight is shining directly on your corporate fraud, you suddenly want to keep family matters private. You do not want respect, Calvin. You want blind compliance. You want a scapegoat to take the fall so you can keep strutting around the country club like you are untouchable. But you are not untouchable. You are completely bankrupt both financially and morally." The crowd of Atlanta elites was absolutely captivated. Nobody moved to intervene. In this specific circle of high society, reputation was the only currency that truly mattered, and they were watching Calvin's reputation be publicly incinerated to ash. I saw Judge Harrison shake his head in disgust and turn away. Winston, the billionaire, who had been ready to loan my father $2 million, was now looking at him like he was a contagious disease. Calvin opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, trying to pull whatever shred of patriarchal authority he had left, but he never got the chance to speak. A massive crash echoed from the main entrance of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany double doors burst open, hitting the walls with a violent bang. The valet staff and two event hostesses scrambled out of the way as a man stumbled aggressively into the pristine reception area. It was Preston. He looked like he had been living in a dumpster for 3 days. His expensive tuxedo shirt was untucked and stained with spilled alcohol. He had no jacket, no tie, and his face was covered in a thick layer of sweat and grime. He reeked of cheap liquor and sheer, unadulterated panic. He scanned the room with wild, bloodshot eyes, completely ignoring the horrified gasps of the women in their designer gowns. "Where is she?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking as he stumbled forward, knocking over a tall floral arrangement. The glass vase shattered across the floor, sending water and white orchids spilling everywhere. "Where is my wife?" He spotted Calvin standing frozen at the bottom of the grand staircase. Preston let out a guttural sound of pure rage and lunged forward, pushing past a group of startled city council members. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my father. "You," Preston roared, spit flying from his lips. "You promised me we were safe. You said you had the federal investigators handled. Preston, shut your mouth right now." Calvin hissed, his face draining of whatever color it had left. "You are drunk. Get out of here before you make this worse." "Make it worse?" Preston laughed, a manic, terrifying sound. "She left me. Your precious, perfect daughter just completely destroyed me. I woke up on the couch in the guest house and she was gone. She took my passport. She took my luxury watches. She logged into my remaining offshore emergency account and drained every single penny. She took the last $50,000 I had hidden away and left me a handwritten note telling me to have a nice time in federal prison." The entire ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Brenda let out a loud, horrified wail from the shadows, completely abandoning her facade of composure. Her golden child had just robbed her fugitive husband and fled the state, leaving everyone else to burn. "You set me up!" Calvin Preston screamed, taking another aggressive step toward my father. "You knew the feds were coming. You let me take all the heat while you tried to secure a bailout from your rich friends. You are the one who authorized the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. I am not going down for this alone. I am telling the prosecutors everything." Before Preston could take another step toward my father, Trey raised 2 fingers in the air. The private security team Vanguard Pinnacle had hired for the gala immediately sprang into action. 4 large men in tactical black suits descended on Preston from behind. They grabbed his arms, twisting them sharply behind his back. Preston thrashed and kicked, knocking over a tray of champagne glasses, but he was completely overpowered by the trained professionals. "You are a fraud, Calvin!" Preston shrieked as the security guards dragged him backward across the polished marble floor. His dress shoes scraped loudly against the stone as he fought them every inch of the way. "Your whole family is a fraud. You are going to prison with me." The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind the struggling man, cutting off his frantic screams. The silence that fell over the St. Regis ballroom was suffocating. Every single guest in the building was staring directly at Calvin. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, utterly isolated, completely exposed, and entirely ruined. The fallout from the charity gala was immediate and completely merciless. 3 weeks passed and the Atlanta justice system moved with blinding speed when millions of dollars were involved. I sat at my kitchen island on a crisp Tuesday morning, sipping green tea while watching the early news broadcast. The lead anchor stared seriously into the camera and announced that a federal grand jury had officially handed down a 42-count indictment against Calvin and Preston. The charges included wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The screen flashed footage of my father being escorted down the concrete steps of the federal courthouse by 2 armed marshals. His custom suits were gone, replaced by a standard-issue gray jumpsuit. He looked entirely broken, a hollow shell of the man who used to terrorize our dining room table. Preston was faring even worse. The news report confirmed he was currently sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial. He had been denied bail entirely because the judge deemed him an extreme flight risk. The irony was absolutely staggering. Preston could not flee even if he wanted to, because his beloved wife had stolen every single dime of his emergency escape funds on the night of the gala. I turned off the television and picked up my car keys. Today was the first of the month. The 30-day eviction notice I had handed my mother in my glass office had officially expired. I needed to ensure my property was entirely vacated. I drove my car up the winding driveway of my suburban townhouse property and parked near the carriage house. The scene waiting for me was the absolute picture of total systemic collapse. There were no luxury moving companies with white glove service. Instead, a cheap dented rental truck was parked unevenly on the grass. My mother Brenda was struggling to drag a taped-up cardboard box out the front door. The woman who used to refuse to carry her own groceries, who mandated that everything be delivered to the Buckhead mansion, was now sweating through a plain cotton shirt. Her flawless blowout was gone, replaced by a messy knot at the back of her head. I watched her drop the box onto the driveway and immediately pull out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed a number. I stepped out of my car and walked close enough to hear her side of the conversation. She was pleading with a high-end luxury consignment broker. I listened as my mother desperately tried to negotiate the sale price of her last remaining designer bag. She was begging the broker for a cash advance, claiming she needed the money by noon just to cover the security deposit on a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a notoriously bad neighborhood on the south side of the city. The broker must have declined because Brenda let out a frustrated sob and shoved the phone back into her pocket. She turned around and finally noticed me standing there. She froze. The deep lines of stress and exhaustion on her face made her look 10 years older. "Are you here to gloat?" Brenda asked, her voice lacking its usual venom. "Are you here to watch us load trash bags into a rented truck?" "I am here to inspect my property, Brenda," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I gave you 30 days to vacate my guest house. It is currently 9 in the morning on the 1st of the month. I want the keys and I want you off my land." Before she could answer, the front door of the guest house swung open. Chloe walked out, and the sight of the golden child nearly made me laugh out loud. Chloe was not wearing a $5,000 tennis outfit or designer heels. She was wearing a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform polo shirt in a bright, obnoxious shade of blue. It had a cheap plastic name tag pinned to the chest. The woman who used to spend her afternoons sipping champagne at luxury boutiques was now wearing the mandatory uniform of a big box retail store. The universe has a brilliant sense of humor. Chloe glared at me, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She dragged a black trash bag full of her remaining clothes down the steps. "You did this to us," Chloe spat, dropping the bag onto the driveway. "I have to be at work in 45 minutes. I have to stand behind a cash register for 9 hours scanning barcodes for minimum wage because you destroyed my husband." "I destroyed your husband?" I asked, taking a slow step toward her. "Chloe, you drained his hidden offshore accounts and abandoned him on the night his entire life fell apart. You left him to be arrested in front of the mayor and the city council while you tried to flee the state." "I was trying to survive," Chloe yelled defensively. "I needed that money to protect myself. But the federal agents seized my accounts anyway. They flagged the transfer as proceeds of a crime and took every single penny back. I have nothing left because of you and Trey." "You have nothing left because you married a thief and enabled his crimes," I corrected her, my tone absolutely devoid of pity. "You thought you were untouchable. You thought Calvin would always be there to write a check and make your consequences disappear. But Calvin is facing 10 years in federal prison, and you are about to be late for your retail shift. Welcome to the real world, Chloe. It requires actual labor." Brenda stepped between us, holding up her hands in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Jada, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "We have nowhere else to go. The apartment on the south side fell through because my credit is completely ruined. We cannot afford the deposit. Just give us 2 more weeks in the guest house, just until I can sell the rest of my bags and jewelry. You have a massive estate now. You do not even need this townhouse anymore. Have some compassion for your own mother." I looked at the woman who had happily drained my college fund, who had watched my father publicly humiliate me, who had tried to convince her high society friends that I was mentally unstable. She was standing in the driveway begging for the exact same compassion she had actively denied me my entire life. Compassion is a two-way street, Brenda, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard pitch. And you burned your side of the bridge to the ground decades ago. You have exactly 1 hour to get the rest of your boxes into that rental truck and drive off my property. If this truck is still parked on my grass at 10 o'clock, I am calling the police and having you both arrested for trespassing. I turned my back on them and walked toward my car. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had simply stopped protecting them from their own reality. But as I pulled out of the driveway, leaving them to scramble in a panic, I knew this was not the absolute end. Desperate people do not just walk away quietly, and my family was entirely out of options. They were going to try one last pathetic move to force their way back into my life. The chime of my private security system echoed through the vaulted ceilings of my actual home. It was a gentle melodic sound, but it immediately broke the absolute peace of my Sunday morning. I was standing in the massive chef's kitchen of my Sandy Springs estate, pouring a cup of pour-over coffee. I did not just own that suburban townhouse where I evicted my mother and sister. That townhouse was merely an entry-level investment property I kept in my portfolio. My primary residence was a custom-built ultra-modern fortress of dark steel imported stone and floor-to-ceiling glass sitting on 10 acres of pristine, heavily wooded land. It was a property that made Calvin's former Buckhead mansion look like a starter home. I glanced at the smart tablet mounted on the marble kitchen island. The live camera feed from my main driveway gates flickered onto the screen. Two figures were standing outside the massive wrought iron barrier looking directly up at the high-definition lens. It was Calvin and Brenda. They did not pull up in a sleek luxury sedan. They had been dropped off at the edge of my private road by a standard rideshare vehicle. I watched through the monitor as my mother wrapped her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders, shivering in the morning air. The woman who used to refuse to wear anything off the rack was wearing a faded generic sweater and a pair of scuffed flat shoes. My father stood next to her looking entirely broken. His shoulders were slumped, his posture completely caved in, and he was clutching a thick stack of manila folders against his chest. They looked like strangers. The arrogant high society titans who had publicly humiliated me at that retirement dinner were entirely gone, replaced by two desperate people who had finally hit rock bottom. I did not press the button to open the gates. I did not invite them inside to sit on my imported Italian leather sofas. I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter, wrapped my silk robe tightly around my waist, and walked out the front door. The walk down my sprawling driveway took 2 full minutes. The crunch of the gravel under my slippers was the only sound in the quiet morning air. As I approached the towering wrought iron gates, my parents pressed themselves against the black metal bars. Their faces were pressed against the cold iron, looking at my sprawling estate with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer desperation. They had never seen my real house. They never cared enough to ask where I actually lived, because they were too busy assuming I was a struggling failure. Jada, my father called out, his voice cracking with a desperate, fragile rasp. Thank God you are home. The security guard at the neighborhood entrance would not let us through, so we had to walk the last half mile. Please let us in. We just need a few minutes of your time. I stopped 5 feet away from the iron gates, keeping a safe physical and emotional distance between us. I stood on my pristine, manicured property, looking out at the two people who had spent my entire life trying to tear me down. The gates stay locked. Calvin, I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. You do not have an invitation to enter my property. State your business and then leave. My mother gripped the iron bars, her knuckles turning white. Tears began to stream down her face, ruining whatever cheap makeup she had applied that morning. Jada, please, she sobbed, her voice vibrating with genuine terror. You have to help your father. The federal prosecutors offered Preston a plea deal yesterday. He took it. He gave them everything. He handed over every single internal email, every signed invoice, and every offshore routing number. He threw Calvin entirely under the bus to shave 5 years off his own sentence. Calvin pressed his face closer to the bars, his eyes wide and frantic. The district attorney is coming for me, Jada. They are preparing a superseding indictment by Friday. They want to give me 20 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud and racketeering. The public defender they assign me is completely useless. He is telling me to plead guilty and accept a decade behind bars. I cannot go to prison, Jada. I will not survive a decade in a federal facility. I am 62 years old. I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the urge to save him. I watched a man face the exact consequences of his own boundless greed. And what exactly do you expect me to do about the federal justice system, Calvin? I asked, tilting my head slightly. You committed the crimes. You enabled the embezzlement. You signed the fraudulent documents to protect your white son-in-law because you cared more about country club optics than you cared about the law. We need a loan, my mother blurted out, her fingers gripping the black iron so hard she was shaking. Just a small loan, Jada. We know how much money Vanguard Pinnacle manages. We saw the gala donation. We just need $500,000 to retain a top-tier criminal defense firm in Atlanta. A team of real lawyers who can negotiate a suspended sentence or house arrest. It is pocket change for you and Trey. You can afford to save his life. I let out a slow, humorless laugh that echoed in the quiet morning air. A small loan of $500,000 to clean up a federal felony, I said, shaking my head. You have absolutely lost your minds. You threw me out of your house. You drained my college fund to pay for Chloe's wedding. You publicly disowned me in front of the entire city. And now you have the absolute audacity to stand outside my gates and beg for my money to save you from a prison cell. My mother began to weep loudly, her sobs echoing through the iron bars. You cannot do this to us, Jada. You cannot leave your own father to rot in a concrete cell. We are your family. We gave you life. Blood is thicker than water. You have to help us because blood is thicker than water. I stepped closer to the gate, stopping just inches from the cold iron bars. I looked directly into my mother's tear-stained face and then shifted my gaze to my father's terrified eyes. Blood might be thicker than water, Brenda, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous razor-sharp whisper. But loyalty is thicker than blood. And you have never shown me a single ounce of loyalty in my entire 33 years on this earth. My father flinched, stepping back from the gates as if my words had physically struck him. You love to quote scripture and use old proverbs when you are backed into a corner. I continued, my voice rising with undeniable authority. You love to talk about family bonds when you are the ones who need saving. But where was that blood bond when I was working 3 jobs and starving in my dorm room because you stole my tuition money? Where was that blood bond when you sat in my office and threatened to evict me from my own home just to protect the golden child who never worked a day in her life? Where was that blood bond when you stood on a stage and told hundreds of people that I was not your real daughter? Jada, please, my father begged, his voice breaking completely. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. I was blinded by my own ego. I see that now. You are the only successful child I have. You are the true legacy of this family. Please do not let them take me away. You do not care about my success, Calvin, I replied coldly. You only care about my resources. You spent 30 years treating me like a liability and idolizing a daughter who abandoned you the second your bank accounts froze. Chloe took Preston's emergency cash and vanished, leaving you to take the federal fall. That is the legacy you built. That is the daughter you chose. You cultivated a family of greedy, superficial parasites, and now you are shocked that they left you to be devoured. I looked at the two of them standing on the asphalt, shivering and broken. They were completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their pride. You planted seeds of deception, narcissism, and greed for 3 decades. Calvin, I said, delivering my final verdict, you watered those seeds with cruelty, and you fertilized them with fraud. Well, the harvest is finally here, and you are going to eat every single bitter fruit you grew. You are going to walk into that federal courtroom with your overworked public defender, and you are going to plead guilty. Because for the first time in your entire life, you are going to take accountability for your own actions. My mother dropped to her knees on the hard asphalt, weeping uncontrollably, her hands reaching through the bottom of the iron gates, grasping at the empty air near my slippers. "Jada, no," she wailed. "Please do not turn your back on us. Please." I took a slow, deliberate step backward, retreating onto my pristine driveway. I reached into the pocket of my silk robe and pulled out the small black remote control for my security system. "Do not ever come to my home again," I said, my voice echoing with final absolute authority. "I am not your daughter anymore. I am just the woman who survived you." I pressed the heavy black button on the remote. The massive wrought iron gates engaged with a loud metallic clank. The heavy electronic lock slid into place, sealing the fortress completely. I turned my back on their desperate sobbing and began the long walk up my beautiful driveway toward my spectacular glass estate. I did not stop. I did not hesitate, and I never looked back. The heavy iron gates clicked shut, sealing out the noise of my parents begging on the street. I stood in my driveway for a long moment, listening to the profound absolute silence that followed. For 33 years, my life had been scored by the constant chaotic soundtrack of my family demands, their criticisms, their endless manufactured crises. Now there was only the gentle rustle of the wind through the Georgia pines surrounding my estate. I turned my back on the gate and walked up the long, sweeping driveway toward my front door. I stepped inside my home, and for the first time in my entire existence, I felt completely undeniably safe. Weeks passed, and the federal justice system operated with the ruthless mechanical efficiency of a machine that had finally caught its prey. I sat at my marble kitchen island on a quiet Tuesday morning, holding a warm mug of jasmine tea. The television in the adjacent living room was tuned to the local Atlanta news station. I watched with detached clinical fascination as the anchor detailed the total liquidation of Calvin's entire life. The federal government was holding a public auction to seize and sell off every single asset tied to his fraudulent empire. The screen flashed footage of the Buckhead mansion, the same house where I had been told I was not good enough, being stripped bare. Government contractors were carrying out custom leather furniture, imported oil paintings, and the very crystal chandeliers that my mother used to boast about to her sorority sisters. The news segment cut to a shot of the luxury vehicles being towed away from the carriage house. Chloe's prized white Range Rover, the one she paraded around Phipps Plaza to maintain her illusion of superiority, was hooked to the back of a repossession truck. Preston was officially serving his time in a federal correctional facility, having taken a plea deal that required him to surrender every dime he ever earned. My father was awaiting his own sentencing, trapped in a cramped apartment on the south side of the city, stripped of his passport, his dignity, and his country club memberships. I took a slow sip of my tea, waiting for the familiar pang of guilt to strike me. Society conditions women, especially Black women, to carry the emotional burden of their entire family. We are told to forgive the unforgivable, to endlessly pour from an empty cup just to keep the peace. I waited for that old, familiar guilt to wrap its cold hands around my throat, but it never came. I felt absolutely nothing for the people on that television screen. I felt no remorse, no sadness, and no desire to save them. I had not destroyed them. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed gravity to do its job. The peace that washed over me was absolute. It was the pure, unadulterated closure of knowing I had finally severed the infected limbs from my life. With the toxic weight of my family completely removed from my shoulders, my energy shifted entirely toward building something that actually mattered. My public relations firm was thriving, handling accounts for national brands who respected my ruthless efficiency and crisis management skills. But personal wealth and corporate success were no longer enough. I had seen exactly what happens when money is used as a weapon to control and belittle people. Calvin and Brenda used their financial status to buy obedience, to create a superficial dynasty built on lies and stolen funds. Trey and I were determined to do the exact opposite. We were going to use our massive resources to construct a legacy built on genuine empowerment. On a bright Friday morning, Trey and I sat at the head of the polished oak conference table in the executive boardroom of Vanguard Pinnacle. We had spent the last month working tirelessly with our legal and financial teams to establish a massive philanthropic initiative. We officially launched the Vanguard Scholars Foundation, a fully endowed trust dedicated exclusively to funding the higher education of underprivileged Black students across the city of Atlanta. We bypassed the traditional country club charities and the high society galas that my parents used to frequent. Instead, we went directly to the community, pouring millions of dollars into full-ride scholarships, mentorship programs, and housing stipends for brilliant young minds who were trapped by financial circumstance. As I reviewed the first batch of scholarship applications, I read the essays of young Black women who were working night shifts just to afford their textbooks. I read stories of girls facing eviction balancing predatory student loans with their academic dreams. Looking at their words, I saw the terrified 20-year-old version of myself staring back at me. I remembered the sheer, suffocating panic of sitting in the financial aid office at Howard University, begging for an extension because my mother had stolen my tuition money to fund my sister's destination wedding. I took all that trauma, all that ancient, lingering pain, and I weaponized it for good. I signed my name across those approval forms, guaranteeing that these young women would never have to choose between their education and their survival. We were not just writing checks. We were dismantling the very barriers that had almost broken me. We were showing the city of Atlanta what true Black excellence actually looked like. It was not about designer bags or gated mansions. It was about reaching back down the ladder and pulling the next generation up with you. The evening after our foundation officially launched the first wave of scholarships, Trey and I stepped out onto the sprawling limestone terrace of our Sandy Springs estate. The Georgia heat had broken, giving way to a perfect, cool night breeze. We stood at the edge of the glass balcony looking out over the endless canopy of pine trees toward the glowing, distant skyline of downtown Atlanta. The city lights flickered like a sea of diamonds in the dark, a beautiful, sprawling empire that we now navigated on our own terms. I leaned against the glass railing, holding a crystal glass of vintage red wine, listening to the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the cicadas in the woods below. Trey stepped up behind me, wrapping his strong arms securely around my waist and pulling my back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, looking out at the exact same view. We did not need to speak to fill the silence. The quiet between us was comfortable, built on years of mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the shared victory of surviving a massive storm. He kissed the side of my neck, a gentle grounding gesture that tethered me to the present moment. I leaned back into his embrace, taking a deep, slow breath of the fresh night air. For the first time in my life, I was not bracing myself for an attack. I was not waiting for an insult disguised as a joke or a demand wrapped in family obligation. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had built a thriving public relations business, the hands that had signed the eviction notice for my abusers, the hands that had just funded the futures of 100 young scholars. I had spent 30 years of my life trying to contort myself into a mold that was entirely too small for me. I had exhausted my spirit trying to earn the approval of a father who only valued submission and a mother who only valued optics. Staring out at the glowing Atlanta skyline, the final profound realization settled into my bones. True power was not just about accumulating wealth or winning legal battles against the people who wronged you. True power was recognizing that I never needed their validation to be spectacular in the first place. I was born resilient. I was built for greatness long before I ever stepped into a boardroom or married a billionaire. I took one last sip of my wine, smiling into the darkness. The scapegoat had not just survived the slaughter. She had become the queen of the entire city, and nobody would ever diminish my light again. True power does not come from seeking validation from those who consistently diminish your worth. It comes from realizing you are the sole architect of your success. Blood might connect you to toxic relatives, but loyalty, mutual respect, and unconditional support are what genuinely define a family. When they try to bury you beneath their unrealistic expectations, use that exact same dirt to build your own unstoppable empire. Your greatest revenge is never just surviving their bitter betrayal, it is thriving so brilliantly that their dark shadows can no longer touch your radiant light. Subscribe and comment your story below.